Okay, hello. I gotta take a picture first. Thank you for all clumping nicely on two sides so I can get two clear pictures. Okay, today, even though the handout has this thing about politeness, I think you guys have had some bit of politeness in another course, right? Yes, no, maybe not. No? You don't cover it in any something else like in the pragmatics, the semantics and pragmatics course that know nothing about politeness?
A little bit. A
little bit. Okay. Well, just maybe when we will go over it, but I want to start with the second part, which Green calls taking turns, and in the book, and then hopefully we'll have time to go back and do the politeness thing. In the past, the students all said, "Oh, we've had this before," so that's why I thought I would skip over it. And so I put a lot more into this second part, thinking that we don't really need to cover the first part. Okay, so what she talks about is taking turns is something that grew out of what's called ethnomethodology or conversational analysis more broadly, where basically this is the reason this name came about is because one of the bad things in the history of linguistics is that linguists generally didn't actually look at language use. They looked at sentences out of context, or they looked at written texts. If anything, if they looked at a connected text at all, it would be a written text. They never really looked at conversation, yet, conversation is where language comes from. And so it's really the primary thing, and it's the way we interact. And conversation analysis got its name because they actually looked at conversation, unlike all the rest of the linguists at the time. This was, 50, 60 years ago. And it actually wasn't even linguists in the linguistics departments who were doing it. It was sociologists who were interested in the behavior of people. And because language is a behavior, they were looking at conversation as a behavior and saying, okay, how do speakers achieve their goals by using language, right? So they weren't actually looking at linguistic forms generally. In the earliest forms of it, they were really looking at why do people say the things they say at the particular instance when they do say it, and in a particular context. And so sometimes the one branch of it, also by sociologists, particularly John Gumpert's, called ethnomethodology. It's called ethnomethodology because ethno means the people, and the methodology is the method of the people for achieving their goals. So the name there is much more, about what they're doing rather than just saying, okay, we're looking at conversation, but they're looking for the methods that people use to achieve their goals, and that's why it's called ethnomethodology. And it differs from other approaches in linguistics in that it only uses a tested natural text, is particularly conversation, focuses on the dialogue and how two or more conversationalists work together to do something, right? So this is another thing that linguistics had always been seen to be something one person did. Language had been seen to be something one person did. Whereas now there's because of the conversation analysis, we now think more like that, where it's actually two or more people working together to do something. It's not just one person doing something, but it's the two people interacting, and that's what I'm going to be talking about a lot today, is this interaction. So that in this case, they're trying to create meaning or to perform actions that convey particular meanings, or other types of things we do with language, but it's mainly to create meaning of some type. So an extension of these methods by linguists who are now looking more not just at these kind of broader sociological type approaches or goals, but also looking at the structures, the actual structures used, and how, for example, typology gets interacted here, so that the structure of different languages affects how we interact, or vice versa, how we interact affects the languages. So they're linguists who are, kind of fans of this methodology and then applying it to linguistics. So people like the University of California at Santa Barbara, Sandy Thompson, Wally Chafe, Jacques Dubois, all of these people. And there's a lot more. Paul Hopper outside that school, Peter Auer in Europe, Elizabeth Cooper Coolin at Stanford. She's in Europe also. I was thinking of Elizabeth Traugott at Stanford, who also is getting into this a little bit. But these people have taken that methodology of using only natural data and looking at not only what they're doing, but more specifically what linguistic forms they're using to achieve it, and how those, in a comparative sense, how those may differ between languages. So the people in these conversational analysis or interactional linguistics look for structures, but not necessarily the type of structures found in lower levels of analysis, like this standard structuralist type analysis of word class and noun phrase and things like that. Although they do sometimes do that, they're structures in which functionally differentiated units are syntagmatically changed into predictable linear sequences. Okay, what does that mean? It means they're things that are chunks of speech that kind of work together, but they occur in a particular order that's kind of predictable, what we sometimes call adjacency sequences. So if I say hello to you, you're most likely going to say hello back. That's an adjacent. That's one of these functionally differentiated units syntactically changed into predictable linear sequence. So see, I can also talk funny. But these structures are not necessarily linguistic structures per se. So these are conversational structures. Though it may not be structure that's the essence of a conversation, but the achievement of communicative meaning and concerted action. For example, they look at question-answer pairs or greetings between people, telephone conversations, and things like that. They started with one of the basic things they looked at was just how do we know when somebody, what to say when somebody says something to us, and how do we know when it's our turn to talk? That was one of the key things that they started to look at. And telephone conversations were an easy thing to record, an easy thing to analyze, because they have a very structured structure. And they also, are usually short and sweet, and so you can take it, you can transcribe it, and then you can figure out how the different aspects of it. So you have your opening, you have your closing. So like how do we start a conversation? How do we end a conversation? How do we know when we can hang up? All of these different things are involved in this structure of a telephone call. So they would look at that thing. And one thing that has become clear from much of their work is how structured many of our conversations are, to the point of almost being like scripts. So we can actually lay out, particularly something that we do often, like a telephone conversation or an interaction at a bakery or something like that. Those things do become scripts, what we call conversational routines or conversational scripts. And there's been a lot of work on that type of thing. There's a woman named Viska at the university, the National University of Australia, that has done a lot on these kind of scripts in different countries. Some scholars argue that interpreting an utterance as the performance of a particular action is achieved through contextualizing factors, pragmatic meaning, which supplement semantic meaning. But the CA scholars would say the opposite, that the performance and understanding of utterances as actions depends on your context. So you cannot understand the context, the actions, or understand what the person's doing unless you know the particular context they're in. So conversation is inherently contextual, and it's constructed through social interaction. So it's really, that's why we call it interactional linguistics. Ethnomethodologists focus on the local organization of talk as it's accomplished by the interactants. So that is the minute step-by-step details of how they construct their interaction, rather than the underlying interpretive schemata or speaker intentions or social norms, which provide more general interactional strategies. So those are two different levels that you could look at, but they focus on these really minute step-by-step detailed level. Now, one of the things associated with this, particularly Paul Hopper has written a lot about this, is this concept of emergence. Now, emergence is something that we find it's not a linguistic concept. It's something that John Stuart Mill had defined in the middle of the 19th century, 1841 or something, 48. Anyway, doesn't matter. It's basically something that emerges out of the interaction of people doing something for some other purpose. So, for example, you may have, if you studied economics at all, you would have heard of Adam Smith and his book called The Wealth of Nations, where he talks about economies developing as if they were an invisible hand that created the economy rather than the people themselves creating the economy. It's just the people themselves are just doing their own trading or whatever, their own little bits of trying to make themselves rich. And that the composite, the combination of all of those together is what creates an economy. So it emerges out of all of these individual actions, but we cannot find a particular single cause of that emergent phenomenon. And emergent phenomenon are all around us. We see them all the time, like a traffic jam. If you're all going to in one direction at the same time, and everybody's trying to go in the same direction at the same time, you're going to end up with a traffic jam. Nobody wants to create the traffic jam, but it's just each of these people has his own goal, and it happens to be something that coincides with somebody else's goal. So in this case, it ends up as a traffic jam. Or the example I gave at the beginning in the first lecture of a path through a field, that's also emergence. So that people walking through a grassy field will wear away the grass and a path will appear. That path is also an emergent phenomenon. It emerges out of the action of these people walking back and forth. It's not that they try to create a path, it's just that they're doing this action of walking back and forth has killed the grass and created a path. And that path can then become recognized, just like an economy can become recognized or a language can become recognized. So language emerges in the same way. So emergence is traditionally defined as an effect that is different from the sum. Oh, I got it right here, Mill 43. So I was wrong both times. Emergence is traditionally defined as an effect that is different from the sum of the effects of each causal conjunct. So this is what I meant by saying that even though all these people are doing this stuff, we can't show that any one of them caused this phenomenon. It's the totality of everybody doing it together that it emerges out of. It is thus a feature of complex systems. So sometimes this is called complexity science. When we talk about emergence, we're talking about complexity science because these are called complex phenomena. Why are they complex phenomena? Because they're not simple. So simple phenomena means you can find a single cause. And so like physics and chemistry are called simple sciences, actually, even though many of you may not think that. If you went through high school physics and chemistry, you may think that's not simple. Those are actually simple sciences. You are now in one of the more complex sciences, linguistics, so good on you. So the reason why the physics and chemistry are considered simple sciences is because you can predict what's going to happen and you can show causality by isolating a particular variable and varying that variable and doing an experiment. But with emergent phenomena like language or an economy or something, or even the human body is also a complex phenomenon because the human body does not follow the rules the way physics, topics and chemistry, components do. So like with a chemistry thing, you can add this component and this component together, and every time you do that, you will get the same effect. It's predictable, and if you run an experiment, you can isolate a particular variable and say, okay, I'm going to test this variable, and then you can find some kind of causal relationship. With complex phenomena, there's so many variables because each one of these people doing their little transaction, or each person in their car, they are an independent variable. So to try to get a handle on that is a really complex problem. There are people who are trying to model this mathematically, but you're certainly going to go crazy if you try to do that because it's extremely complex. Particularly because emergence is a non-teleological process in which multiple factors are operative, which lead to a new yet unpredictable element or feature in a given system. So what does that mean? That means that non-teleological means it doesn't have a goal. It's not done for a particular goal. Teleological means it has a goal. So, there's some things we do that are teleological, some things that are not teleological in this sense. So in this case, The emergence is non-teleological because, like the path through the field, people are not trying to create a path. They're just trying to get from point A to point B in the easiest way by walking past this, over this grass. So it's not something that people do on purpose, and there are multiple factors operative, which means there are many people doing the same thing over and over again, or whatever, like in the path through the field. But those people doing those things, not on purpose to create the path, but those people doing it over and over again create the path. So that's what it means by a new yet unpredictable element. You couldn't necessarily predict something's going to happen. Like, can you predict the traffic jam? Unless it's Qingmingjie and you're trying to get to Chukong, what do you call that? The road right outside our Chukong road outside our campus. Or a feature in a given system. So these things can be almost anything that is created in that way. So kind of without the particular goal there, and without with a whole bunch of people doing kind of similar things, but not the same thing, not working together, but each doing their own thing, but this thing arises out of it. So it's unintentional, so you can't predict the outcome. It's over-summative. In other words, the sum of what everybody's doing is, it cannot explain the result from the sum of, you cannot explain the result from the sum of the causes. So the sum is more than the addition of all the parts. And it's sometimes referred to as a phenomenon of the third kind. So in other words, you have first kind is like natural phenomena, second kind is man-made, purposefully man-made things like an automobile. So that's teleological. And then the third kind is the non-teleological, or the emergent phenomena. Now Hopper applied this to grammar, looking at grammar, looking at language. And he said grammatical structure, like an economy or a traffic jam, is temporary and ephemeral. In other words, it just doesn't last. It has no reality in a sense, no long-term reality. It's just behavior. So you study how speakers produce utterances in their interactions, and you focus on the ongoing creation of new combinations. So we have, as you mentioned later on, anyway, I'll get to it. So let me do it slide by slide. So you focus on the creation of new combinations, and there's no grammar outside language use. In other words, it's not like the structuralist said, where we all have this something what he called lang, the Saussure called lang, this kind of language structure in our minds. Then we all have the same one in all our minds if we speak the same language. And and his idea, Saussure's idea, the structuralist, general structuralist idea, was that this was a stable system that we had in our heads, where everything held together. But what we think now, and particularly from this emergent grammar experience, is that it's just bits and pieces of remembered experience. So this can include all of these things, like different types of constructions, formulate pieces with open slots, things like, kick the button are formulaic, but that you also can have expressions like, can you please, bum, and then there's a blank slot there. So we have a regular pattern there of can you please, and then you can put whatever you want in that slot. So we have lots of those kind of things. We have fixed expressions of many kinds which may or may not correspond to syntactic phrases in a traditional sense. We have fragments. We might have fragments also, but we have fragments of language that is partial utterances in our head. We have discourse markers, including conjunctions such as when and intensifiers such as really and even, and lexical items to the extent that they're separate from the above. So we have all of these things floating around our heads, and what they are basically just our experience of hearing people use the language and our experience of using the language. And it's not, well, we can sometimes remember exactly what someone says, but what we really remember is what we call exemplars. So we kind of abstract away from all the many times that we've heard a particular structure, like a clause structure or whatever kind of construction, and then we have an abstract kind of model of that in our heads. It's not that all of this fits into a tight system, but that we have these bits from our memory. We say, okay, in this kind of situation, you can use this kind of structure, or this kind of word, or this kind of whatever. And so when we're in that situation, we might pull that in, but then we'll change it. So this is one of his insights, is that we always change it as we use it. He says categories don't exist in advance of the communicative setting. Instead, they're constantly being elaborated in and by communication itself. So the categories that are manifested in our language aren't something that we, these, what we mean here is the linguistic categories. They are created in our speaking, in our communication. And they're added to, we change them every time we do it. They're unfinished and indeterminate. It's in this sense that the term emergent is used. Emergent grammar focuses on the boundaries of categories rather than their prototypes, exploring the leading edges of the territory around them as they move. So what that means is just that we're looking at how language changes, because every time people use these constructions, they use it a little differently. So we're not looking for the prototype of that category. We're looking for how people change that exemplar, that prototype, when they use it. So you take something like this, and it also is, one of the things he stresses is that it is not one person talking, and that we're only looking at one person. We're looking at the interaction between two people in the emergence. The emergence comes from the interaction, because, like he gives this example, Sam has taken such an interest in this retirement bit, and then the ... means there's a pause. But then he continues and he says, that it really surprises me. So the way he explains this is that the speaker, this is another thing he talks about, is that we don't actually think out exactly what we're going to say before we say it most of the time. Unless we have some important speech to make or something, then we try to think it all out. But normally when we're in conversation, we're kind of doing it online, as we say. You're just talking, and so you may start with a construction, but then based on your reaction from the other person, or the reaction that the other person gives you, you may change your construction. And this is an example of that, where the guy first started saying, there's two constructions in English. One is, he's taken such an interest in this retirement bit, and then you end. So that's one construction. But there's another one where it's a comparative construction, where you say, he's taken such an interest in this retirement bit that it really surprises me. So Hubbard considers these two different constructions. One is not comparative, one is comparative. But in this case, the guy first starts with the non-comparative one, but then doesn't get any reaction from the other person. So then he switches to using the comparative one to kind of change what he's saying. So you can see that this is very much creating it as you go, this is the way we do a language. It's not preconceived, pre-constructed. And you can see this sometimes in so-called mistakes that we say. So one time I said to my wife, you should eat this, is good for you, right? Rather than saying it as two sentences, this, you should eat this, it is good for you. I just said you should eat this, is good for you, which just glums the two ideas together. And so I kind of in the middle of what I'm saying, I changed construction. And so it ends up being this weird thing. And this is how languages develop. And Chinese has constructions very similar to this. And we can also make up new constructions, of course, like fantabulous, funkalicious, or one of my favorites, babelicious. And what I hear the other day, I heard that my niece had some acne on her back, and they call it backne. I thought that was kind of cute. Not the acne, but the name. Hopper says there is no natural terminus. There's no endpoint to it, no natural endpoint to it, no complete current set of linguistic facts, and no synchronically bounded entity. So he's, going straight forward to kind of contradict the structuralist, because the structuralist said that there is this current set of facts that creates this synchronically bounded system that holds all together. He said, rather, structures are constantly being modified and negotiated during use. So as you're talking, he used the word negotiated purposely, that you are, negotiate usually it's like, oh, will you do this? Oh, yeah, no, I want to, and then you're kind of haggling with the other person. And that's what's happening in conversation generally, that you're kind of seeing how the other person reacts, and then just like this Sam example, you're speaking and then seeing the reaction and then speaking more and back and forth, back and forth. So it really is a kind of negotiation when you're interacting with people. And he says in a footnote on that page, thus the matching of actual utterances to previously available schemas is at best achieved only approximately. Schemas are in fact changed each time they're used. By schemas here is what I'm talking about as exemplars. So it's, it's our mental construct of, that construction or that sentence or whatever. So it's the same idea though. Schema is used in a number of different ways, but in this context, he means that particular structure. Okay, so that's emergence. Anybody have any questions about emergence? I mentioned it in lecture 1, but yeah.
So you said like the human body is a complex phenomenon
Right.
because it doesn't behave predictably.
Right.
Does that mean the phenomenon is actually complex, or does that mean our models are not sufficient?
Both. Actually, so like I said, science developed because if you look at the history of science, it used to be everything was in philosophy because nobody could figure anything out. Then they started to say, well, okay, with physics, like Galileo, rolling balls of a plank and seeing that they come down the same every time, it comes down 9.8 meters per second squared. That's very predictable then. It's like, okay, we're finding some regularity here. And they started finding this regularity. And so then more and more, physics was the first science to kind of peel off of philosophy, and then chemistry and some of the others. But linguistics is still kind of hanging on the edge of philosophy because it's so complex to try to figure out what people are doing. Anything to do with the human body or the human activity really is a complex phenomenon. So that's why I mentioned economics, traffic jams, the human physiology, because I can give you the same medicine that I take, but it may have an entirely different effect. There's no predictability at all there. There's probabilities, but no predictability. So it's not like physics and chemistry at all, where you can absolutely predict. Does that answer your question? Oh, okay. But it's also true that we have no way to really grasp these complex phenomena yet. We have a complexity institute here on campus that's trying to do it, but they're not making a lot of progress because they're going about it the wrong way from my point of view. But when they first came, they had the right idea. They came and talked to us in linguistics and said, okay, this is a poster boy for complex phenomena, so why don't you guys get involved? But then they went into this whole mathematical thing, and it's like, that's not the way I want to go. It's mostly computer people doing mathematical modeling of these kind of things. So I was like, okay. And then they're also very often really clueless people talking about language. So I get really annoyed. But anyway, so any other questions about emergence? No, everything's crystal clear. Okay, so an important part of what they discovered is something that actually is not a linguistic phenomenon at all. It's a general principle of human behavior. Is projection, what they call projection, but is called in psychology prediction or anticipation. So there's a lot of work in cognitive science or neurology, neurophysiological behavior or neural behavior, where they argue that the brain, its main function is to be a predicting machine, to predict what's going to happen next. And because for our survival, we need to kind of have an idea about what's going to happen next. If we have no idea what's coming next, we might find it hard to survive. So our brain has evolved to become this predicting machine. And we use this in many different ways. So we use it, to predict the weather, to predict all kinds of things. But particularly in interaction with people, you can see how we use this on an everyday basis. So like say, for example, you're walking down a crowded street and somebody's walking straight at you. How do you know whether to go to the left or the right? You kind of look at the person and you try to figure something out, either from some way that they slightly move, or like in my case, if I see somebody who looks ethnically Chinese, if they look like a mainland Chinese, I go to the right. If they look like if they look like a Singaporean, then I go to the left, because Singaporeans are used to going to the left, mainlanders are used to going to the right. So and it has to do with the way we drive. So you can see how behavior is kind of general. But it's, in so many different ways. But what they looked at in interactional linguistics and in conversation analysis was, how do we predict what somebody's going to say? And particularly, they were really focused on when do they going to stop speaking, because they noticed when they recorded people's speech that one person would stop speaking and the other person would start speaking within milliseconds. So that person had to have been anticipating that the person was going to stop speaking and that he or she had the option then to speak. So they look a lot about this, what they call these possible turn-taking points in the conversation. So when you can shift speakers and things like that, and how do people recognize those things? And so they will, talk about projection. Projection really is just another word for prediction here, because as the speech act is linear. When we're speaking, of course, it's one sound after another, and the interpretation is also linear. So we don't wait till the person to stop speaking before we start interpreting what they're saying. We start interpreting as soon as they speak, or even before they start speaking. So as soon as you see somebody's facial expression, or you see the way they move and stuff, you might predict they're about to speak, or maybe they think, they start to inhale, so you predict they're going to speak, and then you may even know already what they're about to say because of the flow of the conversation, what you know about the person, things like that. But especially once they start speaking, then you will start to predict what they're talking about and then what's coming after it. And that allows this to be a very interactive kind of event. And this is why the initial segment, which I'm going to be talking a lot about, is important. Because the initial segment, once you hear that first word or whatever, first phrase, you create a context of interpretation already with that. And that influences how you interpret the rest of it. Not only how you predict, but also it colors your inferences related to the rest of what the person says. We anticipate what's to come, and the language form can give us clues to what's about. So we project what's to come in languages. I somehow repeated the same thing twice. Projection in interaction linguistics includes two aspects: the ability to guess what is coming up in the interaction. So this is what I'm just talking about, anticipating the speaker's intentions and what they're doing. But then in language, they notice that there are things in language that are there in order to help the person do this prediction. So this is a very recent discovery that people were totally clueless about, because in the past they just ignored the whole mental aspect of language, and so they just thought grammar is grammar, and it just fell from the sky one day, and it doesn't have any real motivation. Seriously, I'm not kidding. So Chomsky's view is that there was one evolutionary mutation that created language in one person's brain, and then that spread. The grammatical mechanisms for helping the hearer to make such guesses, where you're so-called telegraphing your intentions, in other words, you're letting the person know, and I'm going to give you examples of this, you're letting the person know some information that's going to help them to predict what the interaction's about, and what the speaker plans to do. And the clause is seen in interaction linguistics as the so-called locus of interaction, means where the interaction happens. So all of this kind of mechanism for helping the person with the interaction is in the clause itself. And this is kind of one of the key building blocks of interaction is the clause as a unit. So the clause is precisely that unit which permits significant projectability. The reason why it's important for this interaction is because the clause, as I mentioned, these structures that are built into the clause level are the things that help with projectability, and so that's why they're significant as the core of interaction. And Hopper says projection is what makes verbal communication an open and collaborative affair. As participants develop a sense of where the discourse is going, they tacitly mold it, allow it to continue, harmonize with the speaker's goals, interrupt it with their own contribution, offer supportive tokens of various kinds, or predict when their turn will come. we do all of these things while we're sitting there listening to the person talk. We will say, or we will say, or, whatever else we want to say. That's what these so-called back channels are for. So the back channels, every language has back channels. And if you speak Chinese, by the way, if you go to China, I think some people from Singapore have done this too. When I first went to China and talking to Chinese people, I had not realized that you can't use the same back channels. So I would say like in English, American English, we say when you're acknowledging the other person, right? So this is one of the interactive ways that we use in communication. But in China, when I would do that, they would think I didn't understand them, and they would repeat what they said. So then I had to learn to say instead of because sounds like a question, but means yeah, okay. So there's all of these things that you have to learn when you learn another language. You have to get all of these interactional bits, including how you move, even your mouth shape. Each language has a different mouth shape, a neutral mouth shape. So if you can master that, you'll sound much more like a native. So there's a lot involved in this. And different languages will differ in terms of course, what's considered normal behavior. So like in Japanese, it's considered okay to finish people's sentences for them, or just to leave off not saying something. You can leave a lot of things off and assume the other person will be able to create that meaning. You don't have to be very explicit in your speeches, and that's true of a lot of languages actually, but Japanese is kind of famous for this interactive, very, very interactive aspect of language use. A lot of papers on that. And typologically different languages allow for different types of projection. So particularly in Japan, not in Japan, but on Japanese, there have been a number of papers, Hirogo Tanaka and Ono and Thompson. They talked about how even though Japanese is typologically very different from, say, English, they're also doing projection, but how does projection differ in Japanese when we're using it in Japanese conversation versus like English conversation? And so it's quite interesting what they find, that even though it's, say, verb final and a lot of the information is at the end of the clause, this may be one reason why a lot of the arguments are left out, because you immediately get to the verb where all the information is right there. But there's also these adverbial things that you can put you can either say alone or put at the beginning of the clause, which allow you to guess the meaning of the thing. So like zen, which means it's a Chinese loan for Chenren, but it actually means the opposite. It means nothing. So if somebody can just answer a sentence, what have you got, or something like that, you could say zen, or you can start off with saying zen, and then they know that a negative predicate is coming up behind that. And the same thing like something like betsuni or whatever. So these things can be coming at the beginning, and they're already kind of telegraphing what's going to come at the end. So languages differ in terms of how they help the hearer, and like I said, I'll give you examples. They also differ in terms of what they characteristically or necessarily put into the theme here means the initial position. I'm going to talk more about that. I should have used put into initial position. So like if you look at English, words like if and but and whatnot have to be in initial position. Whereas in something like in Chinese, you say if doesn't have to occur in initial position. It can come after the topic. So there's many ways that languages can differ. And so what are they prioritizing in terms of these things? In English, the initial segment influences the creation of the context of interpretation in terms of constraining the interpretation of the mood, the grammatical mood, such that the addressee can project what sort of interaction the speaker intends to accomplish with the hearer. Because grammatical mood marks, interrogative versus declarative versus imperative. And so right away, when you hear the first thing in the sentences, I'll give you examples in a minute, you kind of know what the interaction is, as long as what the person's elocutionary force is matches the grammatical mood. As we saw, it doesn't always, but sometimes you can figure it out. Other languages can put different elements in initial position to help the hearer project aspects of the interaction that the culture deems salient. And they also differ in terms of what's obligatory initial position. So let's look at English. Halliday was the one who did the most on this. We use the word theme, which comes from the Prague School of Linguistics back in the late 1920s and early 30s. There are a number of different understandings of the word theme, but I'm going to be using it here just as the initial word of the clause, the starting point of the clause. So Halliday, I have writings on this if you ever want to read them, but anyway. Halliday showed that speakers of English have conventionalized the particular use of the speaker's starting point, which is the way I'm defining theme here, to mark the grammatical mood of the clause in the unmarked cases by what appears in theme. So, for example, in an indicative clause, the unmarked theme, the most usual theme, in English declarative clauses, is the subject. So, if you hear the boy lost his notebook or the cup was smashed to pieces, as soon as you hear the word the boy or the cup, you know, first of all, that it is a declarative clause. In other words, they're telling you something about somebody or something, and they've already told you what something or something they're going to tell you about. So it's a brilliant way to tell you right up front what's happening and who I'm talking about in this case. So, but then if it's an interrogative clause, you change the order of the subject and the finite element. So we have these auxiliary verbs in the case if necessary in this case. So like, did you eat yet? So the did carries the finite element. Did you eat yet? So as soon as we hear this finite element like did, does, or the modal verb can, or some other modal verb before the subject, we know immediately it's a yes/no question. So right away, we know, first of all, that it is a question, and second of all, we know what kind of answer is being expected, that it's yes or no. So this, again, is really very straightforward and really helps the person to know with the first word what is coming afterwards, or what the speaker's intention is. With an interrogative that has a WH word, in English, WH words have to occur in the initial position. So they then tell you right away that it is a question, on the one hand. Not only that, but what information is being asked for? Is it what, where, when, how, why? So right away, with the first word, you already know what's going on. So this didn't have to be. None of this had to be. Most languages do not work this way. Almost all languages don't work this way. That's why it was such a weird thing that they took English as the prototype of all languages, like Chomsky saying all languages look like English. It's like, well, actually, from a typological point of view, English is a bizarre language, as many non-native speakers can attest to. But it has these brilliant things, these systems. It's never taught this way, except by Halliday and his people he's influenced. But it's really a brilliant way that's developed for helping the hearer to know what's going on in the interaction. In imperatives, the unmarked theme in English non-negative second person imperatives is the predicator, like in be quiet or sit down or shut up. So as soon as you hear the first word, you know right away it's imperative, and you know right away what is being asked of you. What is it you're supposed to do? So this is why we can't drop like a lot of languages like Chinese and Singlish and whatnot, you can just drop any reference to the person you're talking about or the thing you're talking about or whatever. But in English, we have to have at least a dummy pronoun there or some kind of pronoun there because it's marking the grammatical mood of the clause. Now, if we turn, any questions about English before I turn to Tagalog? Or this question of projection at all? Yeah.
Okay, I just do that, right? For indicative declarative, right? The theme we kind of coincide with the copy from the structure that you were talking about. So
Is it what?
I just feel that the topic comment structure is very similar to the theme ring.
Yeah. So many people in linguistics have confused topic and theme, including Halliday himself, because in the Prague school in general also assumed that topic and theme topic was part of theme, but theme was the starting point, but it was also what the clause was about. So I have a paper where I argue that actually, if you look broader, because what we do is induction, right? So as I don't know, we talked a little bit about induction. In induction, you base your conclusions on whatever data set you have. So if your data set is small, your conclusions aren't going to be that broadly applicable. So when the Prague school was working, they worked on just English, Russian, and Czech. These are all, very similar languages. So, and Halliday, his name in Chinese is Hamida. I've been talking about him the other day in Chinese. So I get carried over. So he also, even though he worked on Chinese and he worked on English, and he knows some other languages, but mainly they're all languages that have topic and initial position. So this led to them confusing topic and theme as one thing. But we're going to talk about Tagalog in a second. I'm going to show you that theme and topic do not necessarily occur together. So I have a paper where I'm specifically arguing with Halliday to say that no, you really have to take into account other languages and see that these are two separate functional structures, right? So theme rime and topic comment. I think my paper is called On Seeing Theme Rime and Topic Comment as Separate Functional Structures, which is good I gave it a topic because that's what it's about. Okay, any more questions? Did I answer your question? Okay, any more questions? Yeah.
So to clarify, projection is not only about linguistic content, right? It can also be based on like gesture.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So like I said, even before you start speaking, you're projecting when the person's going to start speaking, and possibly even what they're going to say, but also maybe their attitude, their facial expressions. We're predicting all the time about what people do, whether it's talking or whether it's any kind of action or whatever. We predict. When somebody's reaching for something, you're predicting what they're reaching for, right? So say you're eating dinner together and somebody goes like that, you will predict without unconsciously. You don't think about it consciously necessarily, but you will just so-called assume. But really, we are predicting that they're reaching for a napkin or they're reaching for the salt shaker or whatever.
So when one says that the clause is the site at which projection becomes significantly meaningful, that's not used.
That's just talking about the linguistic aspect of it, yeah. But projection, or as in psychology they call it prediction or anticipation, that's a much broader phenomenon. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at a very different language where it works quite differently, but it still shows that theme is important. In other words, this initial position is still important for prediction or projection, but it works differently in Tagalog from English, although differently in the sense that what they put in the initial position is different, but it works the same way in the sense that it puts a lot of information in there to help the person know what's going on. So in Tagalog, which is the language of the Philippines, it's a focus initial language. In other words, we talked about presupposition and focus, and I talked about how English and Chinese, the focus is generally the end of the clause. And that's true of a lot of languages, but there are languages like Tagalog that have the focus at the beginning of the clause. And so in general, the predicate, which is very often, as I told you, we mentioned predicate focus structure is the most common cross-linguistically. So in Tagalog, the most common structure you find is with a predicate and initial position because of predicate focus. And the information structure is comment topic and new given rather than topic comment and given new. So you have this front-loaded type of structure. Now the predicate is quite different from other languages. Tagalog generally is a really fun language. It's full of incredible morphology. You want complex, you go to Tagalog. And the predicate can take all kinds of this morphology. There are a friend of mine who teaches at the University of the Philippines said when he takes in a new grad student, he will give the grad student one root word and say, okay, give me all the morphological forms for this language. And the student will go away and come back with a list of 1,000 forms. No joke. 1,000 forms. And he'll say, not enough. Go back and get more. Because it's that complex. It's such a fun language. If you're a linguist. If you're not a linguist, you shoot yourself, gentlemen. So the predicate marks all kinds of stuff, but the main thing is it marks aspect, realis, irrealis, and most often the semantic role of the topic of the clause. So realis, irrealis is kind of like past and future, but it really just means, has it happened yet or has it not happened yet? So it's that kind of sense. And the semantic role of the topic of the clause. So there's an argument that's the topic of the clause, but it's often not mentioned at all because it's a topic, it's kind of active, right? So it's active, so you don't have to mention it. But there is a marker on the predicate of the clause that tells you what is the topic, and I'll give you examples in a second. So the topic, when it appears in, the predicate, when it appears in initial position, it allows the hearer to project the situation predicated, because the action word there, it's not really a verb, but it's the predicate. Its reality status, its aspect, and the semantic role of the participant that the utterance is about. So you can do all this prediction right from there. And the topic in Tagalog is different from what we normally talk about as topic because it actually has a grammatical status as well as a pragmatic status because it has a particular morphological marking. It's not marked by position in the clause at all. It can move around in the clause, but it has a particular morphological marking that marks it as the topic. That's what the clause is about. So it has this double thing. It's very unusual typologically. Generally, any referent, this is another thing that's unusual, any referent can be the topic of the clause, whether or not it's related to the predicate. It's really topic common type of language like Chinese, but it has grammaticalized the marking of the topic. It usually, though, is one that is active, in other words, identifiable to the hearer. So the representation of the topic argument, if it appears and it's not a pronoun, takes a marker of specificity of some type, either ang, which is historically a demonstrative, or si with proper names, or a current demonstrative pronoun, plus a linker, usually yung, to mark it as the topic. So looking at some natural examples from my own fieldwork, this is from a conversation called Making Salsa or Making Sauce. Jirel starts by saying, Madali lang kasing gumawa ng salsa eh. So basically saying, so you hear madali lang means it's easy, and kasi, because it's easy, kasi here doesn't really mean because, it's really used here more for emphasis. It's like it's really easy. And then the topic is this part down at the bottom, ang gumawang ng salsa eh. So this gumawa ng salsa actually is a predicate in itself. It means one making salsa, or one's making of salsa. But here it's made into the topic. So one's making of salsa is easy. I just want to mention here, this here is the thing I was talking about that marks something about the topic. So the reason why, how did I know that it was one's making a topic? Because I know that the here is what we call an actor topic. It's marking the topic of that particular expression as the actor of the clause, the one who's doing the action. There are actually different types of actors, but this is one type of actor. And so Wendy answers, oh means yes. Madali lang, it's easy. And then she continues to say, gawin mo lang ketchup. It's just make it with ketchup. So here the gawa is the same root. You see here, this is gumawa is, this root is gawa, and this takes an infix. So Tagalog has prefixes, suffixes, and infixes. And you can have infixes that go into prefixes. This is how complex this language is. It's just so great. And I'm a nerd for morphology, sorry. But actually, when I was young, I hated morphology. I studied, in elementary school, we studied French. And I was like, 72 forms for each verb? It's like, come on, you know, that's ridiculous. I don't want to memorize all these forms for one verb. And then I found Chinese when I was 17 or so, I was 18. I found Chinese. It's like one verb, one way to say it. It's like, that's my language, you know, no more apology. This is the one I want to go for, right? So that I really like that. But now as a linguist, it's like, no, I love morphology. It's fun to analyze and figure out and stuff. So I've made a kind of a real switch in my life in terms of my attitude. So this gawa is the verb to do or to make, right? So he starts off by saying, you know, making sauce, the gawa. And she says, yeah, you gawa in mo lang ketchup. So the gawa in is pronounced gawin. But here, the gawa with the in suffix, this is an irrealis form, but it's also a patient topic. So we know that even though the topic is actually not mentioned, if it was mentioned, it would mention here like yung salsa. We could say yung salsa, meaning the salsa. We could put at the end. But we know here from the patient topic that we know that the topic is the thing being made. Right? That's why it's a patient topic. So because it's the thing that's being made. So gawa mo ng ketchup yung salsa could be said here, but it wasn't because you don't need to. So just make it with ketchup. In English, we have to put the pronoun in there. You have to say the it. And also, you can't make the salsa in English. It would be difficult to make it with the sauce as the topic. And then she continues, tapos lagyan mo ng tomatoes. So here she changes verbs where the lagay means to put something. So she says, okay, after that, then you put this is the you, the non-topic mo. This shows that it's not a topic. They actually have two sets of pronouns, one for topics, one for non-topics. We talked about that when we talked about reference. Nam tomatoes. So this is also non-topic. This is actually a possessive marker, and it shows that it's an argument, but it's not a topic. So the topic again is not mentioned. It would show up here. But the lagay takes here an instead of in. Now an is a suffix that marks location topic. So it shows here, once you hear the word lagyan, you know that the topic is what something is put into. The thing that's being put into. I don't know if that makes sense. It's the thing, so the sauce is what you put the salt and pepper and the tomatoes into. So so as soon as you hear the word lagyan, you know right away that the topic, even though it's the same topic, it has now changed its role, semantic role, from being the patient, the thing being made, to the thing that things are being put into. Other things are being put into. So, and then the last line is lagyan mo ng salt and pepper to taste, tapos na. Then you're done. So then you put in, again using the same form, put in to the salsa, the salt and pepper. And so the predicate, as soon as you hear the predicate, you know that, and also these pronouns are what we call second position clitics. So they always follow the first word of the clause. So what happens here is you immediately hear the predicate, which has this lagyan. Actually, all of this is predicate, but you hear lagyan, so you know you're putting something into something else, and you know who is doing it. You are to do it. But the thing that you're putting it into is the topic, and you're supposed to be able to recognize that because it's not showing up in the sentence at all. So this is a very different system from English, but it's again using the initial position to tell the hearer a bunch of information that they can then use for understanding the person's intention in what they're saying. So notice how there's no overt reference to the topic in any of Wendy's utterances. The yung salsa, as I said, could have been added to each of these utterances. But we can tell what's being talked about because there's no change of topic and because of the marking on the predicate. This is what's called switch function referent tracking system. Because you're tracking a single topic. It's just like in English, we also have switch function reference tracking where we use passive and active. So like he got up in the morning, he brushed his teeth, he ate breakfast, he walked out the door, he got hit by a car. So you have to change the topic from because his status as actor has changed to status as patient, but we want him to remain topic, then we use the passive. That's what passive is for. So that's called a switch referent tracking, switch function referent tracking system as well. But this one is based on keeping the same topic, but even though the semantic function changes, the grammatical marking also changes to tell us that. Okay, is that clear? All right. So that's basically what I wanted to say about that kind of aspect. Now, Green also has a section in her book on functions, on questions, and conversation. And I'm just going to mention it here because this section shows how a single form can be put to a lot of very different uses and so have very different meanings in conversation. So it's really about inferring the speaker's intention in why they use that form. So a sincere use would be, what are you doing after dinner tonight? And then you would answer with information. Or rhetorical, like, who reads Chomsky? Everyone knows the answer should be right. Or why is he such a jerk? No one knows the answer, but you just can use a rhetorical question like that. Or you can ask a clarification question. Say, what? He asked for $1 million? Or confirmatory. Is that so? You did bring the keys, didn't you? You're confirming something. Or solidarity. That was some game, huh? You start a conversation. And then what? Continuative. Also helping with the conversation. Or commands. Don't you think you should close the door? Using a question form to give a command. So these are all different ways you can use the same question patterns to achieve your goals. And so it's really about inferring intention when we use some kind of pattern. Okay, any questions about that? If not, we can try to do some politeness. We got 20 minutes or half an hour. All right, politeness refers to whatever means are employed to display consideration for one's addressee's feelings or face. So we're going back to the beginning now. So basically it means taking into account the other person. So again, we're going back to interaction. So this whole chapter is about interaction, right? So in interacting, you're not just talking on your own, although some people seem to talk that way. You have to take into consideration who you're talking to and then speak in a certain way that you're not going to piss off that person or upset that person or whatever. So this is what politeness is about. It's you're showing consideration for that person's feelings or their face. So Green says, if we consider to be polite any behavior whereby a person shows regard for another person by trying to make that person feel comfortable or by making an obvious effort to avoid making that person feel uncomfortable, then politeness is a property of any kind of interpersonal behavior. Now this is a good point. Including completely non-linguistic acts, like when you open the door for somebody or you clear a place for somebody. These are all considered polite things to do because you're taking somebody else's feelings into consideration. So it's just an interactive principle. It's not a linguistic principle. Now the first one to really talk about politeness was Robin Lykov, actually one of my teachers at Berkeley, back in '73. And she came up with a three simple, three-way typology of politeness, types of politeness. So the first one she gave is don't impose. And this is, she called it a kind of formal politeness. You treat the addressee and objects discussed impersonally, objectively, more often involved when inferior addresses a superior. The more indirect the request, the more polite it is. So like something like, I'm sorry for bothering you, but do you think you might be able to meet with me on Tuesday? So this is like these kind of more indirect type of way of asking things. So we have so many hedges here. So I'm sorry, you apologize for bothering you. Do you think you might be able to meet with me on Tuesday? So the real thing is just, can you meet with me on Tuesday? Or will you meet with me on Tuesday? But you bury it under all of these hedges, what we call hedges, to make it more polite. Or something like the doctor needs a specimen of your urine in a cup. So a nurse may say this to you in a clinic rather than pee in the cup. That would be a little abrupt, right? It's like they wouldn't be likely to say that. It's considered more polite to make it kind of more roundabout or impersonal. Avoidance of personal topics. Now, this is something I say compare Chinese. In English, there are a lot of things we don't talk about, personal stuff we don't talk about. That in Chinese, it's the first questions they ask you. So when you talk Chinese, it's like when I remember the first time I went to China in 1976. I didn't know Chinese that well, but I knew the first 4 questions they were going to ask was, what country are you from? How tall are you? Are you married? How much money do you make? Right? These are all questions that you would never ask in English generally. Well, maybe what country are you from? But even that's considered rude sometimes. So, but these I got used to the idea that these are the 4 questions. So if I heard guo, country, if I heard gao, height, if I heard some other key word, then I would just answer that question, and it worked really well. So using inference to interact. We also use titles, also familiar terminology for not imposing. You avoid a familiar terminology. You avoid slang or so-called grunt words, or we call it Anglo words. So in English we have like always 2 pairs of words that we call the grunt word and the Latinate word. So the English words or Anglo words are the short ones. Those are usually the foul language because the English were under the French, during the French occupation of England. So we have 2 levels of speech. So we have like, pick one I can use, like shit and defecate, right? So you would say defecate, where shit is considered rude. Defecate, which is the French version, is considered. Of course, they have something more rude, but we're using this Latinate form to be polite. They're called grunt words because they're usually 1 syllable. The use of titles and honorifics to be more polite. Euphemisms, not referring to something directly. So like why we have the names for like the toilet keeps changing because you don't want to refer to the crapper or something like that. So or whatever it was originally called. So then you call it a toilet, and that becomes too direct. So then you call it a bathroom, and whatever. So there's always these euphemisms that develop for talking about things that you really don't want to talk about. And the British have done this to a great extent. This is kind of from something from The Economist, which of course is a British magazine. And everything is what they say is very different from what Americans would understand. So if the British say something like, I hear what you say, to an American, you would think, okay, he accepts my point of view, whereas what the British actually mean is I disagree and do not want to discuss it any further. Right? Or this is in no sense a rebuke, where the Americans would say, I'm not cross with you. The British mean, I'm furious with you and letting you know it. Right? So there's a whole bunch of these. I've got a lot more. You can read these on your own time. But it just shows that, they're being polite by not disagreeing or not showing anger or whatever. You also have languages like Japanese and Javanese that have different levels of structures that you use in being polite, like ii de gozaimasu ne versus iyo, where and then two other levels in between. So and there's also an example on 154. And in Dirbal, there's a language called Dianyu, which is sometimes called the mother-in-law language, which is a more vague and general language because mother-in-laws are never supposed to speak to their son-in-laws. But if they do have to speak to each other, then they use this special language, which is very general, and so it's considered more polite. In Tamil, and Setal, a language of Central America, they use a falsetto to be more polite, especially young women will use a falsetto, very high-pitched voice to sound more polite. I'm going to skip that. So the second thing she comes up with, the second aspect of politeness or type of politeness is offer options. This is a kind of informal politeness, where you express yourself in a way that one's true intent does not have to be recognized. It could also be seen as a way of not imposing your opinion. Participants can have equal status but are not familiar, often involves implicature and euphemism. So if I want you to turn up the heat, I could just say, oh, it's awfully cold in here, or you could just shiver to kind of let them see that you're cold and hope that they get the hint, you know. Have you thought about seeing a doctor about that mole? Or it seems like this sentence might need to be revised a bit. You know, you're telling somebody about their paper, you say, oh, this might need to be revised a bit, when you know for sure it really needs to be changed. Now, the reason it's called offer options is because the person who you're directing it to doesn't have to recognize your intentions. They can ignore your intentions, and then that in that way not be offended by it. I mean, they can accept it if they want to, but they could also just let it go, ignore it. And so that's why it's considered offering options, because your true intentions are not that straightforward in speaking it. Or if you're looking at cars and you think, wow, that's really expensive, and then the guy might say, well, we have a less expensive model, implying that you don't have enough money to buy the expensive model. The third type she comes up with is encourage feelings of camaraderie. And so this is the kind that where all your buddies and your family generally, feelings of intimate politeness, you speak more directly than with type 2 even. You show interest and trust in the addressee and you use this with close friends and intimates. And so these are things like in Chinese, you don't say thank you to family members. Like my wife, and I'm just so habituated to saying thank you to everybody. And all my Asian relatives just say, like, why do you always say that? We're relatives. You don't say, thank you to us. They think it's very off-putting. In Japanese, you use kind of slangish terms. Actually, all languages really. You use kind of slangish terms when you're speaking. You don't make the effort to enunciate really clearly. So instead of saying "inbitsu de wa arimasen," you could say "inbitsu janai." Where you're using an informal predicate, but also the dewa becomes just jan. And then the use of rapid or slangy speech in English, like in New York, did you eat yet? We usually just say, "Did yet? Did yet? No, ju." Did you eat yet? No, did you? Did yet? No, ju. And the use of intimate pronoun in some European languages. So I think we talked about how a lot of European languages have this so-called T and V or tu and vous type things, like in French, where you only use the tu form with intimate friends and the vous form in English. With more politely. And this is why English lost thou, because thou was considered too intimate to be used with almost anybody, so everybody just was you. So that's how then we just stopped using thou altogether. Now another system that developed was Brown and Levinson. This came a little bit later, where they talked about politeness in terms of face, negative face and positive face. So we have this want to have our actions unimpeded by others. In other words, we don't want people to get in our way, right? We don't want people to stop us from doing things. And then positive face is the want of every member that his wants be desirable to at least some others. So this is the part that we have the so-called positive face, means we want to be liked. We want people to think the way we think. We want people to do what we do. This is the whole herd phenomenon thing. So this is positive face. And so then you have face-threatening acts. So when we're interacting with people, we often need to somehow threaten their face, either their positive face or their negative face. And particular types of interactions run a great risk of damaging the face of the participants. So these are called face-threatening acts. And so it could be threats to the hearer's negative face, like as acts which put pressure on the hearer to do something. It's threatening the hearer's negative face because they interfere with the hearer's freedom to do as they please. So when you give somebody an order, or request, or advice, or threats, or warnings, you're telling them what to do, and a lot of people really don't like that. So that's considered a threat to the negative face. So you will try to, as Lykov also talked about, you'll try to soften it by saying, "Can you help me with the gardening?" Or as opposed to, "Help me with the gardening," or "You better be home in time for dinner," would be a very direct order, and so a lot of people wouldn't take kindly to that. Acts which put pressure on the hearer to accept or reject an offer put pressure. But even, I should mention, even when you say, can you help me with the gardening, even if you say it politely, you're still imposing on the person's face. But you're just trying to soften it here. And I'll talk about that softening in a bit. Acts which put pressure on the hearer to accept or reject an offer to put pressure on the hearer and may lead to them incurring a debt. So interfere with the hearer's negative face. So if you offer somebody something, I'll give you $5 if you give me a Coke, you're actually imposing on the person by giving them an offer like that. Or in Chinese, I don't know how many of you get into this, but there's this thing called 人情债, your interpersonal debt, where if somebody does something for you, you then owe them. It's kind of like The Godfather. You know, when The Godfather does a favor for you, you have to pay it back at some point, no matter what they tell you to do. It's kind of like that in Chinese, where you have this debt, this interpersonal debt. So if somebody gives you a gift, you have to give a gift back at some point. If they take you out to dinner, then you have to take them out to dinner at some point. That operates to some extent in the West, but it's really strong in Chinese. So a lot of times people don't want things, they don't want stuff, just because they don't want to incur that debt. Acts which suggest some desire for the hearer's possessions. So sometimes even a compliment can seem threatening, or expressions of envy. You know, I'd love to have a coat like that. You know, one time my supervisor from Berkeley and I both like to wear hats. Although here in Singapore I don't get to wear hats. I have a huge hat collection, but I don't get to wear them here because we don't go outside. But anyway, we both like to wear hats. And one day I saw him at a conference and I said, "Wow, Jim, I really like your hat." And then like a few minutes later I said, "Jim, you know, I really like your hat." And then I said, "You know, in Ireland there's a rule that if a person compliments you on your hat 3 times, you have to give it to him." So then I said, "Jim, you know," he said, "I'm not giving you my hat." So anyway, so he got pissed off at me complimenting his hat. I was threatening his face. So threats to hearer's positive face. So sometimes we do things that will threaten the hearer's positive face. So these are acts that express, one type is acts that express negative opinions of the hearer, like criticism, ridicule, complaints. Why didn't you do the dishes? You know, there's this implicature that you should have done it. Disagreements. Rudd's dismissal had nothing to do with labor losing the election. You know, you could disagree with somebody. This is why we never talk about politics. To be polite in America, you never talk about sex, politics, or religion, because it's too easy to cross lines and get people angry. So we have a rule of politeness that you don't talk about those 3 things. And acts that suggest the speaker doesn't care about the hearer's positive face. So expression of a violent emotions. So you just talking to somebody with violent emotions, you're not really taking into consideration the other person's feelings. So this is considered impolite. Bringing bad news about the hearer or good news about the speaker. So somebody, like you go to Facebook, you watch Facebook and you read how wonderful everybody else is doing, and then you feel crappy. This is a documented thing, that people feel crappy reading Facebook because they feel inferior because they see how wonderful everybody else is supposedly doing. Of course, it's all made up. But so this is also a threat to your positive face. Or of course, somebody tells you bad news about yourself, like, "Oh, this guy hates you." No, that's not something you like to hear. Or the mention of taboo subjects. So there are certain things we're not supposed to talk about, like I just mentioned there, but there's a lot more than that you shouldn't talk about. So if you mention that, then again, you're not taking into account the other person's feelings when you talk about them. So the speaker needs to balance 3 wants: the want to communicate the content of the face-threatening act, the want to be efficient or urgent. So sometimes you're in an efficient situation, you don't want to worry about politeness, or the want to maintain the hearer's face to any degree. So unless B is greater than C, in other words, the urgency is greater than the want to maintain H's face, then you will have to do something to minimize the threat of the face-threatening act. So there are different strategies, some that address the positive face, some that address the negative face. So one is to go off record altogether. So this is the one that Robin Lykov talked about as offer options. We use implicature to avoid having it to be clearly intent, like just saying, "Oh, it's hot in here," but not telling the person, can you turn the heat down, or can you turn the air conditioner up, or whatever. So that's off record. So you can't be said to have actually made that request or something. You can go on record, so-called boldly, which means you're not doing any kind of redressive here, kind of making up for it. Redressive action unambiguously expresses a single communicative intention, like sit down, or I promise to come tomorrow. So you can do that, but in doing so, you may be threatening somebody, but maybe that's what you want to do. Or you can go on record with redressive action. And this is what they spent the most of their book on. The act is done, but with some kind of action that gives face to the addressee to counteract the potential damage of the face-threatening act. There are two forms of redressive action depending on whether the negative face or positive face is being stressed. So they call it positive politeness or negative politeness. So positive politeness is approach-based. So you try to show the speaker wants, the hearer's wants. In other words, you share something with the speaker. So like you talk to somebody about, oh yeah, you both like the same team or something, or you both like the same kind of thing. So that somehow they're the same in some way. And the speaker likes the hearer in order to have the face-threatening act reduce the positive, the threat to the positive face. So in those cases, it's like, so it's say something like you butter the person up before. You say like, you've been my buddy for so many years. We're like brothers. Can I borrow $5? Something like that. So you first build up their positive face, and then you can impose on them, because when you're really that close, then you can ask things. But this is the more positive approach. There are many types of positive approach. That's just one example. Negative politeness is avoidance-based. You try to show that the speaker respects the hearer's claims of territory and self-determination, and will not interfere with H's freedom of action. So that's those things where you use the hedges. You use a lot of hedges, is one prototypical example. So negative politeness often involves self-effacement. So like, oh, I know I'm giving you a hard time, or I know you're busy, and I know I shouldn't be asking you this, but could you write me a letter of recommendation or something like that? So you start with all of this stuff that's kind of acknowledging the person's freedom to, or difficulty in doing what you're asking, and apologizing or whatever, and showing deference, and putting hedges on your illocutionary force, using the impersonal mechanism, the same as Robin Lykov's first type of politeness. Using passives, so you're not saying who's doing it, just that it has to be done. So like a lot of times I'll say to my wife, oh yeah, this so-and-so needs to be cleaned or something like that, where I'm not saying like, yeah, I need to clean this. I'm saying somebody, there's two of us here, right? There's somebody, not me, needs to clean it. Something like that. So you use a softening mechanism like a passive where you don't mention the actor. Or a face-saving line of escape so that it doesn't feel coerced. So like, if you're free, would you mind doing this for me? So then the person say, well, I'm actually not free right now. So you kind of give them an escape. So you have these choices. So either you do the FTA, you don't do the FTA. You can do it on record or off record, or you can do it without redressive action, or you can do it with redressive action, and that would be using either politeness, positive politeness, or negative politeness. Okay, well, I actually got through that. And still 1 minute to go. Wow. Any questions? Hey, what happened to all my slides? My slides are not there. Oh, you know what happened? Wait, give me a second. I'll have to dig up last year's. Wait. Oh, this is from 2020. I don't have my old one, so do I? Oops, wrong one. Hold on a second. Don't leave yet. Don't leave yet. I made this PDF out of my handout rather than my actual slides. So all my examples are in the slides. See if I have an old one on here. Unfortunately, no, not on this one, but I can. All right, I'll show them to you tomorrow. I'll show you all the examples tomorrow. Okay, that's all for today then. Any questions before we go? No? So, are there some questions, I should say? Are there many questions? What happened is I made my slides, and then I produced a handout from those slides, but then forgot to make the PowerPoint of the slides themselves, to copy the PowerPoint. I have it on my machine at home, but I didn't copy it to my USB.